Jon Tan.
Thank you. Hello. Thanks for hanging around to hear me talk. It's very late in the day, I know. Just before I start, though, I want to say what a great job Mark's done. Can I get a round of applause for Mark? Wow. What a great, great couple of days. So I'm going to try and go a little bit quickly because we're running over time a little bit. I want to get to the bar fast. So I'm going to try and go a little bit quick. And there's a lot of stuff in this talk. I wanted to pack it in and give you some value if I could. First of all, I should probably translate the slide. Is that right? Ah! You lie, like a dog on the highway. Okay, so this talk is obviously about web typography. Who in the audience, does anybody consider themselves to be typographers, purely? One person. Okay, what about web typographers? A few, brilliant. Anybody created typeface? Anybody designed a typeface? For the screen? Ah, okay. Good, okay, I can talk stuff now, and if it's not true, no one can really pull me up on it. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about in terms of web type is me, just so you know who I am. Mark introduced me, but once upon a time I did have hair. I want it back. If anybody's got any cure, I'd like that. As Mark said, I'm co-founder of FontDeck. I work at a cooperative called Analog with 4 of the guys, 2 in the States, 2 in the UK. We produce a little web app at the moment called Mapalong, which is in private beta. When I was researching Düsseldorf, before I came here, when Mark asked me to, I discovered something that I didn't know before about one of my design heroes. Do you guys, anybody know who this is? Brilliant. It's just a little test I do to see if people are paying attention. It's Peter Behrens. This guy was here in Düsseldorf between 1903 to 1907. I'm going to read this. He was director of the Kunstgewerbeschule. Is that right? Okay. But he studied painting here too. He was a painter, he was an architect, he was a designer. In 1907, he went to work for AEG as their artistic consultant. He was pretty much the first full industrial designer the world's ever known. When he was at AEG, he did everything. He created the very first corporate typeface, in my opinion. People might disagree, but this was the first corporate typeface ever created for AEG, and they used it everywhere. He also designed the Turbine Hall in Berlin. Like I said, he designed products, packaging, all sorts of stuff for them. Dieter Rams, when was talking about Apple, he cited Peter Behrens as being the first Gestalt engineer, the first designer of the whole, engineer of the whole. And I think as web designers, that's what we do. We concentrate on the whole thing, the whole experience, the whole website, the whole thing that is being built. That's where our focus is. So you've got from Peter Behrens to Dieter Rams to Johnny Ive, obviously inspired by Dieter Rams, and then to your laptop and my laptop. Yeah, that's pretty good history. So let's get on with it. So the adventure so far, website, wow. It's been a bit crazy, hasn't it? First of all, I came to the web like I was in the Goonies. I looked at this thing and I was amazed by it. In 1985, when the Goonies came out, Emigre released a typeface called Oakland, which was like one of the best bitmap typefaces for the screen at that time. It was like revolutionary. It's now in the MoMA permanent collection in New York as a testament to screen typography in 1985. At that time, I was 12 years old. I had no idea what all this stuff was going to turn into. I was too busy watching the Goonies. In 1997, IE4 looked like this. Do you guys remember? Oh my God. But it was IE4. It was actually pretty good. IE4 kind of killed Netscape Navigator. It was weird. But this is all bitmap typefaces, right? This is all, you can see all the jagged edges. They're all alias type. But in 1997, excuse me, of course, IE4 also supported web fonts with Weft and EOT. Amazing, right? We had web fonts in 1997 with IE4. Of course, it was proprietary, it was weft, it was rubbish, it was shit, but it was Microsoft, it was all that stuff. But we had it, we just never used it. You know, bitmap fonts were with us for a very long time. I like my bitmaps more like this these days. This is my analog logo we did in the studio just for fun. And then what happened next is everyone was using this stuff already and discovered it was pretty good on the screen. We were using this. I grew up with these typefaces. I'm sure most of you in this room grew up with these typefaces as their palette. So from 96 to 2002, Microsoft were running the core fonts for the web project and spent thousands of hours hinting these typefaces to work in that really adverse environment to make them as good as they possibly could be. We didn't really respect it, but there was a lot of work that went into trying to make these typefaces decent. And then, years later, in 2007, Rich Rutter, who co-founded FontDeck with me, wrote about the font matrix. He went and analyzed all the typefaces that could appear on your machine with different pieces of software like Adobe Creative Suite or Microsoft Office, and said, hey, maybe we can use these and then fall back to the core fonts for the web. We were desperate. Rich was desperate. Can we just have some more form to play with in terms of type? So this is what the matrix looked like. It's massive. I was going to do a screenshot with like the whole thing, but it was like this big and this high. It was huge. That's what we had to play with. But I was still using Georgia because I trusted Georgia. It's my old friend. But then, in 2007, how come VM Lee at Media 07, he announced that Opera might support web fonts. He kind of intimated it. And then Rich wrote about it. He was like, hey, look, we might have web fonts. He got really excited, did a whole post about how it would work with that font face, suggested a web font service to the world for the first time. Howcom went on to write CSS at 10. Do you guys remember this article? No one? You read this? Yeah, I mean, when I read this, I was like, yes, please, now, tomorrow. And then, short time later, we went and built FontDeck, and people built a whole heap of other font services. And now it's amazing, isn't it? I mean, how many typefaces have we got to choose from for screen? I don't even know. I can't even count. Someone needs to build a service which analyzes all the typefaces on all the services and gives me a list, because I want that too, and I want to be able to go through this list and see what's available to me. And then, maybe very, very shortly, we'll get Gotham and Sentinel and all the rest of these kind of things on the screen too. In fact, it is coming. It's just Jonathan Heffer is particularly precise about what he wants to achieve with WebType, surprisingly. So it's taken a bit of time. But my point to you really is, amongst all these thousands of typefaces and this evolution that we've gone through, web typography is not as tricky as autopolo. This is a real thing. I'm just saying. I didn't make this up, yeah? These are Model T, Ford Model T cars. And they used to play this in Coney Island in 1913. It was like a league of autopolo dudes who used to go out and do this thing. It's amazing. So let's go on with it. Typesetting. My point about typesetting is it's about substance over style, and I'm going to come back to that. Because typesetting really is about two things. It's about legibility for me and readability. Legibility is how recognizable the individual characters or glyphs in that particular font. And I'll explain why that's important in a second, obviously. Readability is how easy is it to understand the text and the whole interface. How is it easy to navigate this website, this web page, this information that you're presenting to people? So it's substance over style. These things have to be considerations for me, and they're very close to my heart, and I try and build them into my work, and I hope you guys do too. You probably do. So the first is to get to legibility. Legibility is really micro-typography. It's concerned with the smallest details of a font or typeface. And it's concerned with the smallest details because of how we read. This is super important. This is a photo I took of a book, which I heartily recommend. If you haven't got a copy, you should just go out, order it now on Amazon if you can get Wi-Fi. It's Josh Tuchuli's Detail in Typography. And it's tiny, but it's very powerful. And this slide is showing how we read. We skip along lines in jumps called saccades. And each time we stop on one of those jumps, we have a pause or a fixation. And what happens is that when we pause, our brain takes a snapshot of the characters, usually to the right of that pause, to understand the text. Now, the way that this happens is that the characters are pulled in parallel, and that means as a whole group all together, boof, into your head, really quick. And then your brain kind of tries to sort it out, and it goes like, oh, okay, where do these letters fit? What are these words? Tries to fit, and it happens super quick. So you can see why it's important that each individual character in a typeface, the legibility of that typeface, each individual glyph is unique, important, or easy to recognize at least. A guy called Kevin Larson at Microsoft, he did a huge amount of research on this. He's a psychologist, doctor of psychology. And he said letters within a word are recognized simultaneously, and the letter information is used to recognize the words. Have you ever done this where you've done a typo and in the middle of the word, and you've reread your own text and you've missed your typo, and you keep rereading and you keep missing the typo? You ever done that? I hope I'm not alone, because I do that all the time. So this is really important. So when it comes to legibility, anybody who's not seen a slide like this want to try and tell me what these characters are in Gil Sans? Any guesses? Who's not seen it before? It's a good guess. Yeah, so 1 is there. It's in Helvetica. Helvetica Neue, there's the 1. And then Sentinel. It's a capital I, a lowercase l, and a 1. So you can see that even in typefaces that we think are amazing and people use all the time, like Helvetica, these things aren't clear. These are details you kind of pay attention to with web type. Same with this kind of stuff. The bottom half of characters on a line are a little bit less distinguishable individually. They have less distinguishing features. Can anybody make a guess at what this says? Yeah, thank you. Well, yeah, we got there, right? But it's a bit tricky. Much easier when it's on the top line. You see that? Much easier. Colombia is the capital of gourmet junk. If you ever want to eat duck fat fries, go to Colombia. Get them everywhere. If you ever want to eat very expensive junk food, that's your place. I know, I used to work there. So, letter form is important for reading. Vincent Conner's Comic Sans, weirdly, is very good for reading, especially if you're dyslexic. And studies show this. Stylistically, we might not like it, but it's substance over style. And if you're seriously dyslexic, like my wife is, or people similar to her, you need typefaces to help you. And weirdly, Comic Sans does help for dyslexia. You might not like that fact, but it's true. Well, there are better ones, I have to say. Sorry, Vincent, if you ever watch this video. I do like you, Vinny, but there are better ones. FSME is designed specifically for legibility, designed specifically to identify each character uniquely as quickly as possible for people with disabilities. So there are ones available on the web like FSME that actually can help here. Just skipping on. Small text is not optimal. I'm going to skip through this section. It's just some guidelines, some stuff I threw in to help, and just to remind you in case you've forgotten some of this stuff. Bigger text is better, and this is why. Everyone seen this? If you haven't seen this, this is Wilson Miner's photo of 11-point type in a magazine versus 16-pixel size type on a screen. And he took a picture to say that the average reading distance of a magazine is sort of like this, right? You hold it right in front of you. But the screen is sometimes further away. Okay, screens change in resolution and size, of course, but as just an example, I think it's a pretty powerful one. So if anybody's setting type on the screen, it should be probably a little bit bigger than maybe you would expect if you come from a print background or graphic design background. Type tracking is not good. It's really not good. It's painful to see. Neither is wide or loose tracking, because it's harder to identify each of the letters as a group because there's more space between them. So my advice is always to trust the type designer with the tracking, especially on the web when we're dealing with low-resolution screens. It's a crude media, as David Berlow of WebType calls it. But the type designer, and this is a really important point, type designers care about this stuff. They're designing typefaces for us to use. We need to take advantage of all their knowledge and all the stuff that they're putting into it and the thought for us. So if we're messing with typefaces, with tracking or with word spacing and stuff, we've got to be really careful and think about why. And I think that would be my lesson to myself as well, because I've done it in the past. Low contrast is not optimal. Err on the side of high contrast. Some problems in harsh daylight, and it can be a little bit tricky sometimes, maybe for certain impairments, but I would always err on the side of high contrast, and this is why. I love what these guys do, by the way. I'm not picking on them because I don't like them. Actually, do you know Ligature, Loop, and Stem? Amazing website, amazing stuff they make, posters, all kinds of different ephemera when they get the time. Everything's great about this, apart from the contrast on the body type. It's too low. They just need to just a little bit, right? Just a little bit, guys. Ligatures, alternates and stuff in running text. For legibility, to be able to skip through this text easily and read it, you don't want to be interrupted by ST and CT ligatures, because we don't see these discretionary ligatures very often, usually. So in running text, they don't help. What they do is interrupt that saccade, interrupt those saccades to fixations and make us pause. You're trying to communicate. So although they look nice, and they're great for display for big sizes, to add a little bit of flavor and color, not great at body sizes. That's so much better. We also switched to old-style numerals, so they're in line with the text. They flow with the pattern, with the boomer, with the shape of each word. Old-style numerals rather than lining numerals. Let me just flip back a second and show you the difference. Now, this stuff we can do on the web. Typefaces have this in there, so when you're picking type, you need just to keep an eye out for these kind of little details, I think. I try to. But web type must also be read by machines like screen readers and search engines as well as eyes. And this is part of what we do, right? We're working on the web. This is information that has to be read and parsed and understood and disseminated by machines as well as just understood by us. So as an example, this is a great little book. I again picked this site to pick on because I like the book, so I'm not picking on them just because I don't. Anybody recognize the typeface? Caslon? Okay, Caslon, super famous book typeface. Set. This is what it looks like. That's what it looks like. Really, that's actually what it looks like with no images and the alt text turned on, just to see. And the reason it was set like that is because the designer chose the book typeface and then wanted to use it on the web with their CT and ST discretionary ligatures, so set the whole thing in type. And this is what it looks like with no CSS. It's not good, right? So I think you guys all know this lesson, but I thought I'd use it as an example of a book which is excellent, but a website which is which could be improved. It could be a lot better than it is. So my lesson really is that web is not print. And the reader comes first always, because readers may be using their ears, not their eyes, and semantic underpinning of the typesetting is really important. So moving on, readability. I'm going to cover the second half. Readability, for me, is macro typography. It's layout, it's rhythm, it's hierarchy, it's all the things that people have been talking about today in terms of ordering content with Steph. And other things like that. There you go. So this is my About page, and I'm using it as an example, not because I think it's really, really awesome, but just because I kind of thought about this stuff when I was building it about 4 or 5 years ago. The way we read or scan a page is a little bit like the saccades and fixations again. We have this pattern. It's like a Z pattern, where if you're doing eye tracking, this is a diagram of the average eye tracking movements of users on another website. You can see what's happening is we have this movement and this kind of Z pattern going across, and we have reverse or regressive saccades where we skip back to revisit something and then move through the pattern again. So if you understand that this is the kind of way that we look around a page, an interface and a layout, then you can kind of apply it, right? So when I was thinking about this, I thought, okay, I deliberately kind of constructed the layout just to facilitate this path. So you have these saccades where you're jumping around, you have these fixations again in a wider context of the whole page, and you have this, what's called a scan path through a document, through an interface. And if you're aware of that as a designer, I think it can really help. If you understand that that's how people read. So my principle really is always to try and set type for readability, on the web, especially. Now, as a contrast, again, I'm picking on someone I like. Grain and Gram is this amazing website where they tell the story of individual craftspeople who are kind of reviving crafts, whether it be butchers or printers or anybody. And they tell these great stories with all this kind of amazing detail. But look, the way they've laid it out. The first column extends beyond the viewport on my machine, which is pretty high res. It's 1680 or something. Each column extends beyond viewport. So I read one, and I've got to go all the way back up again and read the other. I've got to go all the way back up again and read the other. I'm just like, oh, man, I'm tired. I never actually finish any of their articles just because the way they've laid it out. It kills me. And so what I do is I hit the readability button and then stick it all in a single column, which defeats the whole purpose of why they designed it in the first place. This is an example of single column layout done really well for a massive article. Have you guys read this? The Origins of ABC on I Love Typography. It is epic in the biggest sense of the word. Give you an idea how epic, I'm just going to let that scroll while I talk a little bit. What Jon's done here is he's formed this huge document with thousands of years of history into basically a single column with some marginalia and notes and citations, and interrupting the saccades, interrupting the scan path rather, knowing about these saccades, providing fixations with content, with images and with subheads and things like that, to facilitate you being able to read this huge document comfortably. Because what he's looking for here is not impact. He's not looking to wow you and go like, oh my God, that's so beautiful, this interface, I want to kiss it. What he's doing is he's saying, I want you to immerse yourself in this document. Sit and read it and understand it. And so the layout goes away a little bit. It disappears into the background, and all you're left with is these pictures being painted in your mind about the history of where our alphabet and our language comes from. Awesome, awesome work. It doesn't, it's not mind-blowingly kind of revolutionary graphic design, but it's readable, and that's the principle. So my advice is, wherever possible, especially with longer text on the web, if you want to design for readability, make it easy for people. One column, interrupt the flow gently, know and use fixations in the scan path, provide people with fixations in the scan path so that they can pause, take in, scan it, come back, understand how people read like that. So this is our analog site. I mean, we bashed this together, literally, guys, in like a couple of days for fun, really, because we just need to have something because we were launching a new business. Actually, we were just going to work on Mapalong, our app, full-time at this point. So we didn't really need to sell ourselves to clients too hard or anything like that. But when we put it together, I was thinking, I just want to make this super readable. So I just did a little simple baseline grid primarily. And because it's the web, and I wanted to show you this, you'll notice that the type is not sitting on the line. And there's a reason for this. And the reason is that web type, CSS, we don't use baseline and leading. We use line height, right? There's no baseline in CSS. No one knows where the baseline is. It's just movable point. So if you want type to fall back from what you're selecting on different machines, sometimes that type might have different baselines. So if baseline points in the line height, so I did it like this because I wanted to fall back, maybe. I used a grid, hash grid, that we created. It's there for free if anybody ever wants to use it. But it is a fixed grid. Probably these days, you're probably better off reading something maybe by Ethan or do research on flexible grids. But it's still a useful tool. OK, skipping. Hierarchy. If you want to interrupt the scan path with something, it's useful to have a palette of techniques and tools to do that. I observed a designer the other day in my studio putting together a layout. And like the entire sort of history of graphic design seemed to be going into this layout. He was kind of struggling, and he was asking for help. But what he did is he kept on iterating all the subheads and the headings and changing sizes and switching things around until he'd gone down this path that made kind of no sense and had to just trash it all and start again. And it made me think that typographic hierarchy, when you're applying headings and subheads and trying to create this emotion or solicit an emotion from the person who's reading it, it should be done gently. I mean, these are some of the techniques, obviously, you guys all know. You can use hue, color, luminosity to have a hierarchy. You could use style and case with the same size type even. My studio mate, Elliot, launched a site recently where he used one typeface at one size throughout. You could use size for a hierarchy if you want to, and of course you can use white space. So we've got a pretty deep array of tools that you can use. But I would say pick gently, interrupt the flow, interrupt the scan path gently with these kind of fixation points, with this kind of styling. Don't do what my studio mate did, which is kind of get sucked down a rabbit hole of playing with things until you kind of like lost, you haven't got a system at all, you've just got a series of mistakes on a page or on an interface. On the analog side, it's one typeface, primarily, unless it has to fall back, 2 sizes, 2 cases, uppercase, lowercase, and 5 colors, 4 of which are just tones, really. So there's nothing to it, it's just super simple. Oh. There we go. So, measure, line length. This is kind of critical for me on the web in terms of reading. Oftentimes I come across a lot of websites where the line length is way too long or way too short for me to actually read the text in any kind of reasonable way. And traditional typography has taught us about this for years and years and years. It's common knowledge that, as Robert Brinkhurst says in his awesome book, Elements of Typographic Style, if you haven't got this book, I recommend you go buy it. Probably in hardback version, because you're going to get a lot of use out of this. It's a beautiful thing to read. He said anything from 45 to 75 characters is widely regarded as a satisfactory length of line for a single column page. For multiple column work, a better average is 40 to 50 characters. Okay? Now, but that's kind of a guide, right? So I broke it with the analog site. My measure is 77 characters. Font size is 1M, or 16 pixels, because 1M is basically whatever default font size is in the browser, and browsers have 16 pixels as their default font size. And line height is 1.5M, so it's 1.5 times the font size. I'm giving it as an example because the content determines what the best typesetting for it would be. So if the content is snappy and short, maybe marketing and advertising that we do a lot of. Steph again gave some awesome examples of that earlier in a content talk. Then you can change and adjust these kind of guides as you go along. Line height is 1 lead, just in case that's not clear to anybody. I don't want to patronize you guys. I'm sure you probably all mostly know that, but it's basically the same thing. And 1 lead is my God. Everything I do in terms of design is based around this figure. I want to make the text legible and readable, so I set it with generous or some kind of leading there, 1.5 times in that case. And then I use that figure and multiply it across my interface in terms of grids and in terms of other values to build out everything else. It just gives me a starting point. It's not a rule, but it makes me feel comfy. It makes me feel nice and cozy inside. So, skipping on, choosing type. Eve, did you guys see Eve's talk last night? Eve, yeah, wow, man, wow. Thanks, Eve. That was far too awesome. I don't like you anymore. But he did a great talk about choosing type, so if you didn't get a chance to see it last night, definitely pick it up on the video or something. He did a great bit on it. For me, choosing type is, again, we talked about substance over style. Functional type for me is beautiful type, because it works. And we're still on the web dealing with a crude media, and it has to still work. So I say, these are my kind of principles that I usually apply, or things I'm going to talk about now, is utility before form, emotion and style, and superfamilies, or combining type. So, utility before form. I know this sounds really obvious, right, but choose from licensed web fonts. We often have clients, or I've had clients where I need to do some web stuff, some print stuff, they might have an application, they might have all these different things going on. You have to make sure those typefaces are licensed. So the easiest way to do that is just to use web font services as your library to select from. Too many times, designers that I know have gone and said, and asked me on Twitter or something, where can I get this particular typeface for the web? And my answer is, I don't know. I don't think you can. But they've gone and sold that typeface and that idea and that concept to their clients and then kind of done the work after they've gone to find out if they can actually use it. Backwards. So utility before form. So pick from these guys. Obviously, I prefer if you pick from Font Deck, but no pressure. Because the main reason is this is our canvas. This is a cathode ray tube from 1938. I believe in Germany it's still sometimes known as a brown tube. Is that right? Okay. Imagine that. Look at that, 50 centimeters. That's a big screen in those days. That'd be like a 30-inch Mac screen these days, right? This is our canvas, though, now. This is what we have to work with. What I've done is I've sized these relative to one another based on the number of pixels in the display. So obviously an iPhone 3 and a HTC Desire are not, the HTC Desire is not that big compared to the iPhone 3. But what I've done is sized them relative to each other, so we can understand the relationship in pixels a little bit. And I just want to cover text rendering really quickly. There's a guy here today, Carsten Looker, who's, if you get a chance to talk to him at some point, he's an amazing typographer and font developer. He knows this way better than me. But I wanted to give you as designers and developers an understanding of what we're dealing with. Most browsers use the native text rendering engine in the operating system. Now, Windows has 3 flavors: standard smoothing or anti-aliasing in black and white, GDI plus clear type, which is when the fonts are smooth on one axis. It was okay. And they have direct write plus clear type, which is awesome, where the type is smoothed in 2 axes, both directions, and they can start drawing it at sub-pixel increments, so the tracking and the spacing between letters can be really good. OS X, core text, core graphics, it's always been pretty consistent, pretty solid. It's probably the one that we're all most familiar with. And the difference between the two is Windows gives control back to font developers. Windows says, hey, if you want to spend millions of hours hinting your typeface to optimize it on Windows, you can do that. Here are the tools to do that. Whereas OS X goes, you don't want to do that. We'll just do it for you. It's just a philosophical difference in approach to rendering type. And most other devices, including most phones and sort of other things, TVs, for example, use FreeType as their renderer. So, in case you didn't know, it's not that big, right? That's not that many things to deal with in terms of testing, really. But browsers sometimes do weird stuff, right? Browsers sometimes do stuff like this, which kind of really bugs me, makes me crazy. So, just a word to keep an eye out on the browsers, even though most of them, for rendering, will use the renderer of the operating system. For layout, they don't always respect or use the layout engine in the operating system. But the good news is, as Jonathan Heffler said at Ampersand earlier on this year, the idea gives rise to a variety of forms, meaning that typefaces now are being optimized and produced into fonts for different uses. So Heffler Fred Jones right now are spending thousands and thousands of man-hours in tweaking their typefaces into fonts that are perfect for use on the screen. And oftentimes that means redrawing them. They're there, they're helping us. It's great. It makes me feel less nervous. It means these experts are doing my job for me. They're making the act of choosing type a little bit easier. As an example from the past, Bell Centennial this is Bell Centennial in 8 Faces magazine. It was designed to be typeset at 6 points, so that's what we did. It was designed by Matthew Carter, who's this guy, who also designed Georgia and Verdana. And you can see the shapes of Bell Centennial? Aren't they weird? They were there because Bell Centennial was intended for use here in phone books at a particular size in an adverse environment, just like the web. The screen is an adverse environment for type because it's low resolution. This is low-quality paper, very high-speed printing. So Matthew Carter knew that if he designed these little ink traps into the typeface, because he's very good at what he does, when it was printed, the ink would bleed and fill in those gaps. And then when you were reading it, you recognize the format, it'd be legible. So that's what happened with Bell Centennial. And I think the year was 1976. You can correct me if someone, but I think it was 76. who's designed that. And that's what's happening on the web today. Type designers are designing typefaces and optimizing them for the screen wherever they can. Not everybody, but a great many of them. Doing our job for us. Typefaces like this. This is a new release from Type Together, Abril. Typefaces, as Eve said last night, they often have a very particular purpose in mind. I mean, Abril's got it in the name. Abril display regular and text regular. You can see the differences, right? You can see the fact that the G are very substantially different. The text face has got a larger X height, slightly less stroke contrast, so from thick to thin, it's slightly less, there's slightly less differences. But they've been designed with a particular purpose, one for text and one for display. So again, designers are helping us to do our work. So when you're choosing typefaces, it's important to kind of remember that and try and look for those kind of tools for us to use. Utility is everything on the screen. So just to sum up quickly, utility before form. What screen, what devices, where is this typeface going to be used? Is it going to be display and running text, footnotes, tabular data? I would always choose and test the smallest text on the page first. I know it sounds weird, but I would test footnotes and stuff and type for footnotes first. Because if that works, you can build a palette up from there. But if you start with display and then you work down to the footnotes, by the time you get to the footnotes, you might end up with a weird choice because it has to work at small sizes. Language support, what does it need? Extra features, what does it need? Do you want old-style aligning numerals, fractions? Do you need small caps? So, moving on, emotion and style. When I'm choosing typefaces, or when I think that we should choose not based on how they look necessarily, but how they feel. And that's a really woolly thing, right? They're a really woolly concept. But emotions are really what we're trying to solicit from people looking at our work. This is a great example of emotion in, yeah, okay, skipping. Okay, great example. No, there was no conversation in WALL-E until 22 minutes in. Nothing, no talking for 22 minutes. But it still was a great movie. I watched it with the kids. I wouldn't have probably watched it otherwise, but I loved it. Color, again, is a good example of emotion, some kind of communication, sensory input to us, which solicits. We recognize what colors are, but we don't have names for them. We say things like it's a lime green or a reddy orange or things like that. So we're having these emotional reactions to sensory input without necessarily having the language to describe what they are. And it's the same with typography. In a great book, Branding with Type, they said typography influences the subconscious so strongly that conditioning the observer with type is not only possible, but definitely happens whether we want it to or not. Example, Eves did something similar last night. This is bellow by Underwear. And does anybody know what this word means? The word means hate in Malay. But if you looked at the typeface, you would never think that. And this is love in Malay, set in grave blade by Typodermic. But you would never necessarily associate that shape, that form, with that same emotion. So the form of a typeface is super powerful. I think that websites are places, not postcards. And the reason I say that is because we're designing this sense of, we're designing experiences that we want people to hold on to move through, with the scan path and with all the rest of these tools at our disposal. And we're designing experiences we want them to move through, which to me sometimes remind me of sort of cities. They have their own unique identity, and type is a core component of that. So type shapes our experience of cities. Echoes in our memory long after we've left, and if we see things, artifacts from those cities again, we remember them. Like, it's an obvious one, right? London, or New York, or Paris, or my favorite, Barcelona. The type tells us a lot about this. So my advice is go armed into type galleries, take emotions as a requirement with you, based on all the stuff we've been talking about in terms of the technical requirements for the typeface, how it needs to perform. Trusting the designer a little bit with some of that, but take emotions as a requirement. Then, as Eve talked about last night, research a little bit, understand the cultural forms of the typeface, where it's been used before, what it means to different people, and the historical provenance of the typeface, and then find a match for that emotion that you're trying to create on the screen. And they are there. Just the last few bits. Superfamilies, combining type. I talked about this earlier, impact versus immersion, how I described the display versus body. Or you can use different things for this, sort of advertising work versus more sort of information design. But I like to think of it as impact versus immersion. And one of the tools that I use to combine type in these two areas, in display and body, or impact and immersion, is some basic font metrics that I'm aware of, and I wanted just to share with you. If you want to combine typefaces, you can look at these kind of metrics of the typeface for the body, and look at similar things or related metrics for typefaces that you use elsewhere in an interface. So similar X height, similar baseline position, similar kind of cap height relative to ascender height, descenders, counters. I didn't want to go into too much detail. I just want to give you guys a quick glimpse overview. But one typeface, one type family, one superfamily can work really, really well. Now, this is Trent Walton's site. I mean, it's an exercise in absolute simplicity. And obviously, it's meta serif, all set in. Just two sizes. It's subdued, but it's lovely to me. I love seeing this. Even though meta serif is used a lot of places, I still love seeing it. Another example is Eden Spiekerman itself. Eric Spiekerman obviously designed meta, and his own site, he uses, of course, he uses one of his own typefaces. In this instance, Unit Slab. But again, one typeface, one font really, well, two fonts if you count the bold, across the whole thing. Ministry of Type, one typeface, Bliss, Jeremy Tankard, used across the whole thing. It's beautiful. You don't need a huge typographic palette. But you can choose a superfamily that has display maybe options, has different weights in it, maybe has different widths in it. And because the type designer has done the work for you and related all these different fonts in the typeface together, it's like a ready-made palette. Fantastic. But then combining fonts. This is an awesome article. If you've not read it, it's on typography.com. It was originally an email. It's Combining Fonts by Jonathan Heffler. And he uses emotion to do this. He talks about wit, a palette with wit, that has a certain mood to it. The more distant the moods in typographic palette, the friskier the design will be. I'm not sure I would have used the word friskier, but, it's okay. And he describes tungsten as tough, Gotham as cheeky, Archer as sweet. It's a lovely way to think about combining in different typefaces. And again, he does it here, palette with energy, Sentinel, Knockout, which I'm using as well, both. And, then he moves on, he's got different ones, palette with poise, and a palette with dignity. I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to skip through this a little bit. My point is that if you look at type from the point of view of emotion, if you've got this solid baseline underpinning, understanding the technology, understanding the utility of type that you need from it, understanding that you want it to be legible and readable in the interface, then as soon as you've got that as your baseline, then you can start thinking about emotions, and everything becomes almost second nature, because you've already done the hard technical bits. On? Yes, we're good? Okay. Whew. That was probably a relief, right, for a little bit. My point is that you can get to emotion, as you've got that solid underpinning, then suddenly you can get to emotion, and you don't have to worry whether the typefaces are available or they're going to work or not. You've done all that work already. You've had an eye on it already. So then you can get to the really good stuff. Method and Craft combines Scholar and Proxima Nova, I think extra condensed. And it's not something that I would necessarily put together, but it conveys something. They're trying to find an emotion with this, and it's a great website. Boston Globe uses Georgia, and the typeface is Miller Headline, which I didn't recognize at first. But the reason I put this up here is because this is about readability too. They chose highly legible type, but then gave it lovely white space for a newspaper website. Awesome white space. It's like a delight to me to see so much lovely white space on a newspaper. Again, setting display. Hellenic Wide and Proxima Nova again for one of the Lost World Fairs. Frank Camero's Atlantis. Amazing what you can do with web type, right? Another one, Kitchen Sink Studios. This is using Bodoni, Poster Bodoni, and another typeface which I have to check actually, Brandon Grotesque. I'm not as good as Eve. He recognizes every typeface there's ever been. But again, this is display, right? So what they've done is they're telling a story using display typesetting And this is most of the jobs that we have to do. We have to mix display elements, which is to grab people's attention, have an impact in them, and then move them into an immersion where they need to read something, absorb some information. So we have these two dual cases going on, which can be served easily with really good web type. These things can help. Lettering.js helps. If you guys haven't seen this before, you should totally check it out. It just allows you to have much more fine tuning over how you set type. Also, fit text is also another really cool tool. I'm just skipping through. And this is just one last thing about how to think about type. This is a font shop. They're font lists. This, to me, is something that we're trying to do at FontDeck. Because I approached type and I was super confused by all these typefaces. I just didn't have a clue how to sort them in my mind. It was just thousands and thousands of them. What Font Shop have done, and this is a good place to start if you're trying to build a typographic palette for yourself, Font Shop have gone and ordered a group type by things like alternatives. So Comic Sans alternatives. I'm not sure how popular that is, but it's pretty cool. It's got it there. Futura alternatives, Gil Sans alternatives, Helvetica alternatives. Then by application for mobile fonts, newspaper text, different applications, branding and identity. And organize them by period, by years, and by genre. Really great place to start if you're trying to build your own typographic palette as a web designer and you've not been working with lots of type for a long time. And the last thing about type and new stuff is open type for the web. This, to me, is going to be the big thing next year for us all for display. I'm going to give you a quick example. This is Pimlico by Fontsmith. You can see the beautiful swash P. Fernando Melo, Brazilian, designed this. It's just, the curves are so lovely. And he's designed all these swashes with it. P, F, M, X, and Z for my son's names that I've sneaked into 8 Faces #4 without anybody knowing, for Zhen and Zai. These swashes aren't available to us on regular typefaces because they're alternatives that we have to select. But Pimlico is available as a web font, obviously from FontDeck. I'm pimping my own thing, sorry. But then also now we have expert subsets with the swashes in them as well. So instead of just setting beyond tellerrand like this is web text, by the way. This is in a browser. I just took a screenshot of it and put it in the slide. Instead of setting it like this, we can set it like this, really easily. The way we do that is we just include 2 font faces, have a little hook to change the font face we use for the B and for the T, and then use this expert subset to set those particular characters. And then we can have swashes. Wow. We can do what print designers have been doing for like 1 million years. That would be really cool. So my last point. There are no rules, really, with this stuff. And don't listen to anybody who tells you there's hard and fast rules you have to follow. There's a common understanding of knowledge that we can follow, and we can research and find out about, and maybe listen to a little bit, like the stuff I've been going on about. But actually, there are no rules. You should just look at that stuff and then, in context, create your own rules for web type. But rely on the people around us who've already done the work, like the type designers. One principle I live by is that I love this phrase. I heard it when I was a kid, and it stayed with me ever since. Is live the questions and one day grow into the answers. And I think this is what we're doing with web type right now. We keep on asking questions like Simon referred to all the time, inquiring in why we do our work, how we do it, especially around this sort of things. And one day we'll grow into the answers, maybe. And as a last parting shot, when it comes to type, I think after you've learned all the little guidelines, some call them rules, and the typefaces and everything else, we get to a point where Simon referred to this too, Collie referred to this as well, where, like Bruce Lee said, you don't think, feel. Because it's like a finger pointing at the moon. Don't look at the finger or you'll miss all the heavenly glory. If you concentrate too much on the rules and on the constraints and the technical elements of this, and your focus is all there, you miss all the good bits. Do that stuff. By all means, learn it and find out about it. And then just let it be there in the background when you're doing your work. And I think it will all work out well. So let the adventure continue.